Broke veteran inherits rotten orchard and old dog until his K9 dug up a hidden $35 million vault. Chapter 1. A Scar That Won't Heal. The last thing Wyatt Langston expected to inherit was a decaying apple orchard and a dog. The lawyer on the phone had said it like it meant something. You'll also assume responsibility for the animal on the property. It's in the will, Wyatt had laughed, a short, bitter sound. What did he know about taking care of anything anymore? It was late fall in Portland. Rain tapped at the cracked windows of his apartment as he stared at the eviction notice lying on the coffee-stained table. 4 years out of the army and still nothing fit. Not civilian jobs, not therapy, not marriage. Abby had lasted 2 years. She said the silence between them had become unbearable. She wasn't wrong. There were days Wyatt barely recognized the person staring back at him in the mirror. Just another veteran with busted knees, a busted wallet, and memories that came with their own time zone. The orchard was in Northern California, just outside a town no one bothered putting on maps anymore. 30 acres of dead trees and a rundown farmhouse that hadn't seen paint in a decade. Wyatt packed everything he owned into the back of a borrowed Ford Bronco and drove south with nothing but black coffee and AM radio to keep him awake. The road narrowed into a gravel stretch by dusk, lined with brittle trees that leaned like forgotten soldiers. The gate to the orchard was hanging sideways, chained but unlocked. As he stepped out of the truck, a chill rode the wind straight through his jacket. He was halfway to the porch when he saw the dog. It stood motionless, back straight, paws planted, as if guarding something sacred. A German shepherd older, from the look of the greying muzzle but alert, coiled like wire. Eyes sharp, intelligent. Not your average backyard pet. This was a working dog. No bark, no growl, just the kind of stillness that made you hesitate. Wyatt froze. "You Hank?" he asked. The dog didn't blink. The leash attached to the railing looked ornamental. Hank wasn't going anywhere unless he wanted to. Wyatt reached out slowly, expecting resistance. Instead, the dog stepped aside. Silent permission. Not acceptance, just allowance. Inside, the house smelled of old smoke, oil, and dust that clung to the walls like regret. Furniture draped in yellowing sheets. Wyatt dropped his duffel next to the fireplace and tested the light switches. Nothing. Power must have been cut years ago. He found an old lamp, lit it with a match, and sat on the edge of a torn sofa. Hank settled a few feet away, facing the door, like he knew how to listen to wind. Wyatt poured some tap water into a chipped bowl, setting it near Hank. The dog didn't drink, just kept watch. "You're not much for introductions," Wyatt muttered. "Me neither." The silence wasn't awkward. It was thick, grounded. Hank didn't ask for affection. He didn't need it. They were the same that way. Sleep came in fragments. Wyatt took the upstairs bedroom, but the mattress sagged in the middle, and the ceiling was cracked from water damage. Outside, the wind kept tapping the siding like a ghost with nowhere else to be. At some point past midnight, he heard it. One bark, then another. Sharp, controlled, not frantic. Wyatt's body snapped up before his brain did. Old instincts. His hand reached for a weapon that wasn't there, breath caught mid-chest. He moved fast, grabbing a flashlight and heading downstairs. Hank wasn't at the door anymore. He was already gone. Outside, the orchard was silvered by moonlight, branches twisted like claws. Frost crackled under Wyatt's boots as he followed the sound. Hank's barks had turned into low growls, rhythmic and constant. He found him near a gnarled tree that stood apart from the rest, bigger, older. The dog was digging furiously, paws throwing dirt behind him in wide arcs. "What is it?" Wyatt asked, breath fogging the air. Hank didn't look up. His focus was absolute. Wyatt crouched and brushed the surface where the dog had started. The ground gave easily, too soft for soil that hadn't been turned in years. He dug with his hands, dirt packing under his fingernails, until he hit something hard. Metal. Cold. He cleared the top of a box iron, rusted, heavy, and dragged it out with a grunt. It wasn't locked, but the clasp resisted like it hadn't been touched in decades. With a hard pull, the lid groaned open. Inside was no treasure. Not the kind he understood anyway. Just a brass key, small, engraved with unfamiliar letters, and a folded note, brittle with age. Numbers and letters filled the paper in blocky print, too neat to be random. Some kind of code. Wyatt's hands trembled as he held it up to the moonlight. "What the hell is this?" Hank sat beside him, silent now. The kind of silence that waits. Wyatt looked at the key again. A Swiss bank logo, subtle but unmistakable. The orchard had just changed. So had the man who inherited it. He wasn't looking at a rotten patch of land anymore. He was looking at a vault. And somehow, the damn dog had known. The wind picked up, rattling the skeletal branches above. Wyatt pocketed the key and the note, eyes scanning the field like a soldier back on recon. A shadow moved near the tree line too fast, too deliberate. Not the wind. Someone was watching. He stood slowly, mind sharp now, breath even. He hadn't been Wyatt Langston the Ranger in a long time, but maybe it wasn't too late to remember. Hank stepped forward, body low, ears pricked. Whatever was buried out here, they weren't the only ones looking for it. And this time, Wyatt wasn't alone. Wyatt stood at the edge of the porch, staring at the animal like it might suddenly vanish. But the dog didn't move. He just watched. Every muscle taut, every line of his body alert, balanced, deliberate. The leash, frayed and faded, hung loosely from the railing, untouched. Wyatt didn't see a pet. He saw a soldier. He took one step closer. The dog didn't flinch. Eyes locked on his face, not aggressive, not welcoming either. It was as if the dog was assessing, measuring something Wyatt himself wasn't even sure he still had. Discipline, purpose, authority, or maybe just worth. "You're Hank, right?" Wyatt said quietly. Still no bark, no growl, just that unwavering stare. Wyatt crouched slowly, careful not to break the unspoken line between them. "You and I are supposed to be roommates now, apparently." His voice came out hoarse from the road, and too many months of talking to no one. "I'm Wyatt." I don't snore. Much. The dog blinked once, then almost imperceptibly shifted weight from one paw to another. Wyatt reached for the leash. Hank stepped forward, not toward him, but past him, as if to say, "You can follow, but you're not leading yet." Inside the house, it was worse in daylight. Dust motes hung in the air like ghosts. The walls bore stains from years of storms and neglect. But it held something else, too. Something heavier. Wyatt couldn't name it. Not yet. But he could feel it, as if the walls were listening. Hank circled the perimeter of the living room, nose twitching, paws silent against the wooden floor. Every movement was trained, precise. This dog wasn't a stray that had wandered onto the porch. He belonged to someone once. Someone who knew how to shape muscle and instinct into something dangerous and noble. Wyatt opened the cabinets. Mostly empty. One can of beans, 2 dusty mugs, and a half-melted candle on the counter. He lit it just to see the flame. "You hungry?" he asked. No answer, of course. But Hank's ears twitched at the sound. Wyatt found a bag of kibble under the sink, still sealed. Expiration date long past, but it was something. He poured a cup into a ceramic bowl and placed it down gently. Hank didn't move. "You're not going to eat." The dog looked at the bowl, then back at him. Waiting. Wyatt exhaled, stepped away, and sat at the kitchen table, letting his hands go slack. Suit yourself. Eventually, Hank padded over and began to eat. Not like a starving animal. No frantic gulping. Just steady, methodical bites, controlled, like everything about him. Wyatt watched in silence, feeling like an intruder in his own inheritance. The sun slipped behind the mountains fast. The orchard, even dead, managed to darken the sky early with its dense lines of twisted branches. The wind picked up just after 9, howling between the broken slats in the fence. Wyatt sat on the porch in an old rocking chair that creaked with every lean. Hank lay at the top of the steps, still, head up, ears constantly turning toward distant sounds. "Why'd he keep you here?" Wyatt asked softly. Was he trying to tell me something? The dog didn't turn. Wyatt's mind kept circling the same questions. Why a dog? Why now? Why him? When he finally turned in for the night, he left the bedroom door cracked. Hank didn't follow him up. He stayed by the front door like he belonged there. Like he always had. Wyatt didn't sleep. Not well. He tossed, turned, stared at the ceiling until the cracks in the plaster began to look like maps he couldn't read. And when he did drift off, it was to the sound of gunfire in his head, always back in Kandahar, always behind the blast wall. He woke to barking. Sharp. Piercing. It cut through the air like a round cracking off the edge of a Humvee. Wyatt sat up too fast, heart hammering, instinct dragging him back into a world where barking meant mortars or worse. He grabbed the flashlight from the floor, shoved his feet into boots he hadn't untied, and bolted downstairs. Hank was already at the door, barking low and urgent, not wild, not panicked, tactical. Wyatt yanked the door open and stepped out into the freezing night. The wind had shifted. It smelled like rain and copper. Hank took off across the yard, his body low, tail stiff, movement silent except for the occasional huff of breath. Wyatt followed. The flashlight beam danced across dead grass and bare branches. The orchard looked like a graveyard of limbs, every trunk twisted and blackened. Hank moved with certainty, pausing at the edge of a fallen shed that barely stood on one hinge. He barked again. One time. Focused. Wyatt caught up, breathing hard. "What is it?" Hank sniffed the ground, then looked up at Wyatt. Not at the shed. At him. Then the dog circled once around the far side of the porch, nose pressed low. Wyatt swung the light around and stopped. Footprints. Fresh. Leading from the orchard to the side of the house. Not his, not the mailman. Too clean, too precise, like boots. Military issue. He crouched, placed a hand over one print. It was still damp with dew, not more than an hour old. "Someone was here," he said aloud. Hank stood motionless behind him. Silent now. Wyatt swept the light across the yard, then over the orchard. Nothing moved. But someone had been watching, and they hadn't expected a retired dog with combat instincts to still be on duty. He looked at Hank. "You weren't sleeping, were you?" The dog tilted his head slightly, the only answer he'd give. Wyatt stood, eyes scanning the distance. Whoever was out there had gotten close, too close, and if Hank hadn't barked... He didn't finish the thought, just reached down and placed a hand on the dog's back. "You're not just guarding this place," he muttered. "You're guarding me." The dog didn't move. Back inside, Wyatt checked the windows, locked the back door, and sat in the living room with the flashlight still in his lap. Hank lay at his feet, one ear turned toward the orchard. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The orchard didn't sleep, even if the trees looked dead. Wyatt had tried to go back to bed after the barking incident, but his nerves wouldn't settle. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the light shift across the orchard in narrow ribbons. The trees cast long, finger-like shadows over the frost-bitten ground. Hank didn't move from his spot near the door, but his eyes stayed open, trained on the horizon like he expected something to step out of it. By mid-morning, Wyatt finally stepped outside. The cold bit into his neck, but he barely noticed. Hank was already at the edge of the field, nose pressed to the dirt under one of the larger trees near the back row. The tree stood alone, its thick trunk twisted like rope, roots bursting from the earth as if they'd been trying to claw their way out. Hank barked once, a low, clipped sound. Wyatt jogged over, boots cracking the frozen soil. "What is it?" Hank didn't respond. He was too busy digging. Paws moved in tight, practiced strokes. This wasn't play. This wasn't curiosity. This was work. Wyatt dropped to one knee beside him. The ground was soft here, softer than it should have been. Damp, too, like something had been disturbed recently. Hank stopped for a moment and looked up at Wyatt, dirt dusting the grey fur around his snout. "All right," Wyatt muttered. "Let's see what you found." He shoved his hands into the hole, pulling out clumps of cold earth. His fingers scraped something hard. Not stone. Metal. He kept digging, the shape emerging slowly. A box, rusted on the edges, about the size of a toolbox but heavier, thicker. He hauled it out of the hole, the weight surprising him. Hank stepped back, ears up, tail stiff, watching. Wyatt wiped a sleeve across the top. No markings, just decades of dirt and corrosion. The latch resisted at first, then gave with a loud snap. The hinges creaked open. Inside was nothing that belonged on a farm. A small brass key rested on a folded scrap of paper. The key was stamped with a familiar, logo too familiar. Swiss Bank. Clean, elegant lettering engraved on the shaft. Wyatt stared at it, breath frosting in the air. No way. He unfolded the paper. It crackled, yellowed with age. Lines of numbers and letters filled the page in a strange sequence. Not coordinates, not bank account format, but precise, intentional, like someone had written it for someone specific. Hank sat beside him, calm now, but watching. Wyatt looked from the key to the paper, then back to the tree. Who buries something like this in the middle of nowhere? His voice sounded thin in the open air. He glanced around instinctively, feeling the prick of eyes even when none were there. This changed everything. He stood slowly, tucking the paper and key into the inside pocket of his jacket. The box he left buried under a layer of loose soil, just enough to keep it hidden for now. Back at the house, Wyatt dropped the key on the kitchen table and stared at it. He'd spent most of the last 4 years digging through the rubble of his life-burnt-out dreams, medical forms, unpaid bills. He never expected to dig up a Swiss bank key beneath a dying orchard. Hank curled up near the wood stove, but his ears still twitched at every creak of the floor. Wyatt opened his laptop, fingers stiff with cold. The screen flickered to life, the cursor blinking like it was waiting for him to start connecting dots. He typed in the bank name on the key. Pages loaded slowly on the spotty connection. Nothing concrete. No account info, of course. But the logo matched. This wasn't a souvenir or fake. It was real. He ran the string of characters from the paper into 3 different code decryption tools. Nothing. Too long to be a password, too structured to be nonsense. He leaned back, rubbed his temples. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had buried that on purpose. And it wasn't recent. "Hank," he said aloud. The dog looked up. "You just found something big." Hank stood, stretched, and walked to the table. He nudged Wyatt's thigh with his nose, a gesture both grounding and unshakable. There was a knock at the door. Wyatt froze. The knock came again. Not frantic, not friendly either. He moved to the side window, careful not to disturb the curtain. A man stood on the porch. Well-dressed, charcoal suit. clean shoes that didn't belong anywhere near a muddy road like this. He held a thin leather briefcase and looked entirely out of place in the broken landscape. Wyatt opened the door halfway, foot braced behind it. "You Wyatt Langston?" the man asked. "Depends who's asking." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My name's Gray. I represent a group of investors interested in distressed properties. We heard you recently came into ownership of this land. It's not for sale." "That's disappointing. We're prepared to offer you well above market value. Not interested." Gray tilted his head. "Are you sure?" The orchard isn't exactly... Thriving behind Wyatt, Hank appeared in the doorway, ears forward, posture rigid. Gray's smile tightened. "Well," he said, "if you change your mind, give me a call." He handed over a card. Matte black. No logo, just a name and number in silver ink. Then he turned and walked back toward a sleek black car parked at the end of the drive. Wyatt shut the door slowly. He turned the card over in his fingers. Hank was still at his side, eyes trained on the window like the man hadn't left. Wyatt dropped the card into a drawer without looking at it again. He pulled the key and the paper back out of his pocket. There was a vault, somewhere, hidden behind numbers and time, and someone else knew it existed. But they hadn't counted on Hank. The dog didn't bark at ghosts, he barked at threats, and today he'd barked before Wyatt even knew he was being watched. Something waited beneath this orchard, and now it had a name. The card sat on the kitchen table like a loaded weapon. Just a name, Lucas Gray, and a number printed in clean metallic ink. No company, no logo, just the kind of confidence that didn't need an introduction. Wyatt stared at it while Hank paced by the front door. The dog's gait was slow, measured, but each step landed like punctuation. Hank didn't like him, not at the door, and not now. Wyatt trusted that. He opened the drawer and shoved the card in next to a stack of past due notices and a cheap utility knife. The Swiss key still sat beside his laptop, catching the pale morning light. It didn't shine. It glared. By noon, Wyatt couldn't shake the feeling. He stood at the window, scanning the orchard. Hank stood beside him, eyes locked towards the tree line. Every so often, his ears twitched. It wasn't paranoia. Not anymore. He grabbed his jacket and headed outside. The orchard was still, but it didn't feel empty. Something about the air too quiet, too held. Hank followed without needing to be called, his pace tense, steps silent. The two of them moved through the trees like they were back on patrol, each step cautious, deliberate. When they reached the old shed, Hank paused and sniffed the ground near the doorframe. Then he growled. Low, deep. Not a warning. A verdict. "What is it?" Wyatt whispered. Hank pawed at the ground. Wyatt knelt. Fresh boot prints, not his. He turned sharply, scanning the horizon. Nothing but dead trees and pale sky. But someone had been here, close enough to touch the walls of the shed. Back inside, he locked the door behind him and slid the deadbolt for the first time since arriving. Then he sat, hands resting on the edge of the table, heart still beating too fast. It was almost dark when the knock came again. 3 taps. Calm. Confident. The same rhythm from the day before. Wyatt opened the door, slower this time. Gray stood in the exact same position. Same polished shoes, same uncreased suit. But his smile was thinner. "Mr. Langston," he said, "I was hoping you'd reconsider." "I haven't." Gray's eyes flicked past him, scanning the hallway behind. "It's a generous offer. Too generous." Gray nodded slightly. "We like to invest in undervalued properties." "Property or what's under it?" Gray's jaw tensed, just for a second. "I don't follow." Hank appeared at the door frame, standing tall, muscles coiled tight, his head low, eyes locked on the stranger. This time, he didn't wait for a cue. He growled, deep and unrelenting. Gray's smile didn't falter, but he stepped back 1 inch. Is he trained? He's retired, Wyatt said. Not soft. Gray adjusted his cuffs. If you'd rather go through legal channels, we can arrange that. Wyatt raised an eyebrow. Legal for what? Delinquent taxes. Historical claims. Any number of technicalities. His voice never rose. This is bigger than you, Mr. Langston. Wyatt stepped outside, closing the door behind him. Hank followed, silent. You want something buried out here? Wyatt said. You showed up less than 48 hours after I did. That's not real estate interest. That's intel. Gray didn't deny it. Just looked at him, measured. There's more than one version of history. Yours doesn't need to end here. Wyatt stepped in close, so they were eye to eye. You're not buying anything. Gray looked over Wyatt's shoulder at the orchard. That would be unfortunate. He turned without another word, walking back toward the black sedan waiting near the gate. Its windows were tinted too dark for rural code. The vehicle pulled away without headlights. Wyatt stood there long after the dust settled. That night, Hank refused to sleep. He lay near the window, head lifted, body facing the orchard. Wyatt stayed awake too. He knew that look. The same one Hank had in combat zones when something was about to go wrong. The next morning, Wyatt hiked the perimeter of the property. Near the eastern fence, he found fresh cigarette butts crushed into the dirt. No boot prints. Whoever had been watching knew how to cover their trail. Back inside, he powered up the laptop. He needed to know who Lucas Gray really was. It took hours of digging burner emails, offshore registries, obscure filings, but eventually a name surfaced. Not in real estate, not in any public portfolio. Apex Holdings, private, old, quiet, and dangerous. Apex had been tied to a half-dozen investigations into corporate laundering, all quietly shut down. They bought silence the way most people bought property, fast and in cash. He closed the laptop and sat back, breathing shallow. Gray hadn't offered to buy the orchard out of kindness. He'd come to erase something. The orchard was a vault. Hank had found the first clue. Wyatt was standing on the rest. The door creaked behind him. Hank stood there, eyes locked on the window again. Wyatt followed his gaze. Across the field, a shape moved behind the trees. Gone before he could stand. He reached for the drawer. The knife was still there. So was the card. The name on it burned like a brand. Lucas Gray. And Hank just kept watching, like he knew they'd be back. Wyatt sat behind the wheel of the Bronco, staring at the old county library like it might collapse before he could walk in. It was a squat brick building with faded green shutters and a flag that hadn't been replaced since Reagan. The sign out front still read, "Open Tuesday through Saturday," even though it was missing the T. Hank waited in the passenger seat, head resting on the window, eyes scanning the sidewalk. Always watching, always listening. Wyatt stepped out and shoved the key deeper into his pocket, the brass still cold despite the heater running the whole drive down. The slip of paper with the coded string felt like it was burning through the lining of his jacket. Inside, the library smelled of dust and old pine cleaner. It was quiet in the way only places full of forgotten knowledge could be. The woman behind the front desk was small, late 50s, glasses strung around her neck, cardigan hanging off one shoulder. "Can I help you find something?" she asked. "I'm looking for old employment records," Wyatt said. 1970s, for a man named Harold Langston. She blinked. "Langston, your grandfather." He paused. "Yeah." She stood, already halfway to the back. "You'll want the archive room. Follow me." The room was colder than the rest of the building. Rows of filing cabinets stood like tombstones, each drawer labeled by year. She pulled one open with a groan. "He was a bookkeeper, right?" she asked. "Or something with numbers." "Yeah, accounting, I think." She handed him a thick folder marked Corporate Financials, 1974 to 1980. If he worked for anyone important, it's probably in there. Wyatt took the file to a corner table and flipped it open. Dust billowed from the first page. He coughed once and settled in. Hank lay at his feet, paws outstretched, tail still. The first few pages were boring. Payroll, vendor names, a list of local suppliers. But then he found it, a company called Merrin Holdings Limited. It had a subline, Consulting, Financial Structures. Harold Langston was listed as External Auditor Temporary Contract. Wyatt frowned. The file showed a list of transfers. Routine stuff until it didn't. The next page was stamped Confidential Review and dated 1978. It referenced a flagged audit. Discrepancy found in Auxiliary Allocation Fund 7C. Estimated discrepancy. $35 million. There was a handwritten note at the bottom, circled twice in red ink. Possible off-ledger movement. Inquire. Langston. Wyatt sat back. $35 million. His grandfather hadn't just worked for these companies. He'd been inside their systems. Deep inside. And someone had noticed. Why didn't this ever come out? He murmured. Hank raised his head slightly, ears pivoting. The audit never escalated. The paper trail died 2 pages later. No legal filings, no press coverage, just silence. And now, decades later, Wyatt had the key. He copied everything, page by page. Took photos with his phone, double-checked the dates. When he walked out, the librarian handed him a sticky note. "Your grandfather used to come in here all the time," she said. "Always carried a black notebook." Wouldn't let anyone else touch it, Wyatt's stomach knotted. "Notebook?" She nodded. Said it had his real work in it. Back at the orchard, the sky had turned a flat, bruised grey. Wind scraped against the farmhouse siding like fingernails. Wyatt stood on the back porch, the printouts flapping in his hand. Hank stared across the field toward the far corner of the property. He barked once, short, sharp. "What now?" Wyatt muttered. Hank didn't move, just kept his gaze pinned to a collapsed stone wall near the tree line. Wyatt followed him, flashlight in hand. The cold hit harder in the open, and by the time they reached the wall, his breath came out in clouds. The old well was there, barely visible beneath a heap of dead branches and rotting boards. Wyatt crouched. Hank moved beside him, nose working over the surface like radar. "You think something's down there?" A low whine escaped Hank's throat. Then he pawed at the boards with growing urgency. Wyatt cleared the debris. The mouth of the well gaped open, 10 feet wide, ringed with crumbling stone. A rope ladder lay curled beside it, dry and brittle but intact. He tied it off to a thick root and started down. The air grew damp and earthy as he descended, flashlight clamped between his teeth. At the bottom, his boots hit packed dirt. He scanned the space. Just mud and rock until his light caught a metal glint behind a loose stone. He pried it free. A tin box, rusted on the hinges, wrapped in what looked like old oilcloth. He opened it slowly. Inside were stacks of documents sealed in plastic, the kind used to survive fire and flood. Ledger pages, handwritten, precise. The same penmanship from the audit. And in the middle, a list of shell companies and coded transfers, some going to Switzerland, Singapore, Panama. This wasn't just documentation. It was proof. Every line detailed how $35 million had been pulled from multiple corporate slush funds and redistributed into hidden accounts. The final page hit harder than anything else. Beneficiary, W. Langston, next generation. Wyatt staggered back against the stone wall. His grandfather hadn't stolen the money. He'd hidden it. Not for himself. For him. Hank stood at the top of the well, looking down with that calm, steady gaze that had started everything. "You knew," Wyatt whispered. The dog's tail thumped once against the stone. Back in the farmhouse, Wyatt spread the papers out across the kitchen table, the ledgers, the audit pages, the key. Hank curled beneath the window, paws crossed, but his eyes never closed. Outside, the orchard creaked with secrets, and inside, Wyatt finally understood this wasn't about land, this was about legacy. And it had just begun. The orchard had stopped being quiet. Wyatt felt it before he saw it, the subtle shift in the way Hank moved, the way the birds scattered too early in the morning, the way light seemed to slide off certain corners of the property like it had something to hide. It began with a sound in the night. Not barking, not footsteps, just the creak of a floorboard on the far side of the house that shouldn't have moved. By the time Wyatt got to the window, there was nothing there, but Hank didn't return to his bed for the rest of the night. He stood by the door, tail stiff, eyes locked on the orchard like he was tracking ghosts. By the second night, Hank had shifted entirely. He no longer slept in the same spot. He rotated locations, door, window, porch, back fence, like he was running a perimeter. Wyatt didn't tell him to. He just did it. And then came the morning when Hank refused to eat. Wyatt poured kibble into the ceramic bowl like always, but Hank ignored it. Instead, he stood at the back door, waiting. Not anxious, not upset. Waiting. "You want something out there?" Wyatt asked. Hank looked back at him. One slow blink. Wyatt grabbed his jacket, the flashlight, and the map he'd started drawing based on the papers from the well. Hank trotted ahead, leading the way. Not toward the tree. Not toward the well. Toward the old tool shed. It sagged hard on one side, rotting at the base, half covered in ivy. But Hank didn't stop at the door. He circled around, nose pressed low to the ground, tail twitching. Then he froze, paw resting on a plank of warped floorboards. Wyatt crouched beside him. The plank was loose. He pulled it up, revealing compacted dirt and something wedged beneath it. A small, square tin, newer than the one they'd found before, still rusted but sealed tight. Inside was a rolled parchment, brittle and yellow. Wyatt unrolled it slowly, brushing off bits of soil. A hand-drawn map, rough, faded but unmistakably the orchard, and on it 7 red X's, all scattered across the 30 acres. Some marked near trees, some near fence posts, one nearly under the barn. Wyatt let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You're leading me through his memory," he whispered. Hank sat beside him, still and steady. They started that day, crossing off 1 red X at a time. At the 3rd marker, near a split fence post, Wyatt found a jar sealed with wax containing a list of encoded account numbers, all matched against different shell corporations. At the 5th, under the barn floor, they uncovered a fireproof envelope filled with international wire confirmations. Each spot was real. Each one mattered. But someone else was catching up. On the 6th night, it happened. Wyatt was up late in the kitchen, notes spread out across the table, trying to piece together the order of transfers, when Hank rose like a shot, body snapping into alert. He let out one sharp bark, then growled low and guttural. Then the sound came. A click. Outside, near the shed. Wyatt grabbed the old rifle from above the mantel, his hand steady from muscle memory, not confidence. He nodded once to Hank, who was already at the door, waiting. They moved together. Out into the cold. The orchard was dead quiet. Moonlight fell in broken lines through the branches. Somewhere near the tool shed, a shadow shifted. Too fast to be an animal. Too smooth. Hank took off without a sound. Wyatt followed, boots thudding against the soil, flashlight beam swinging until it landed on movement. Someone in dark clothes running, vaulting over the eastern fence line. Hank caught up first. There was a yell, sharp and panicked, as the intruder hit the ground. Hank didn't bite. He didn't have to. His size and speed alone were enough to bring the man down. Wyatt caught up seconds later, heart pounding. The man was already scrambling away, leaving behind a black duffel bag. No weapons, just equipment, binoculars, a listening device, a folded map. Wyatt opened it. The same orchard, same layout. But someone else had drawn their own X's, and they were closing in. Back at the house, Wyatt locked every door. He sat on the floor with his back to the wall, staring at Hank as the dog laid down again, still breathing hard, but eyes never leaving the window. "You remembered the map," Wyatt said. "Not the paper one." The real one. Hank looked at him, unmoving. "You've been guarding this for years, haven't you?" There was no response. There didn't need to be. Outside, the wind picked up again. But this time, Wyatt didn't feel afraid, because now someone was fighting to take something from him, and they didn't realize yet he had a soldier on his side, one who never forgot. Gray came back on a Monday. No black car this time. No forced smile. Just a gray suit and a thin manila envelope he didn't bother hiding. Wyatt didn't invite him in. They stood on the porch, eyes level. Hank stood between them, unmoving, his head lowered just enough to make a point. "You've had time to think," Gray said calmly. Wyatt nodded once. "I thought about a lot." Gray extended the envelope. "This isn't an offer." It's notice Wyatt didn't take it. "Claim of unlawful possession of assets tied to corporate holdings." Gray continued. "Historical misappropriation, tax violations, securities fraud. Shall I go on?" Wyatt's hand twitched at his side, but his voice stayed flat. "You're bluffing." Gray's lips didn't even twitch. "No, I'm simply informing you that the inheritance you've received has questionable legal standing, and Apex Consortium has retained full rights to pursue restitution." Wyatt laughed under his breath. "Restitution for what?" "You don't own a damn thing here." "Perhaps not yet," Gray said, slipping the envelope onto the porch railing. "But the burden of proof is a heavy one. And Apex is very, very patient." Hank shifted forward, just slightly. Gray noticed. "I would advise you to keep your dog leashed, Mr. Langston," he said without looking down. "The next time someone gets hurt, you may not have the law on your side." He turned and walked away, disappearing around the bend without another word. No car, no sound, just the quiet echo of a threat well delivered. Wyatt didn't move for a long moment. Then he picked up the envelope and tossed it straight into the fireplace. That night, he couldn't sleep. Hank paced. The house groaned louder than usual. The walls creaked like they were bracing for impact. Wyatt loaded the old rifle and left it propped near the front door, just in case. At 2:37 a.m., Hank's body stiffened like someone had flipped a switch. He moved toward the back door, slow, focused, nose twitching in the air. Then he growled. Not the deep, territorial kind. This was sharper, more urgent. The sound that said someone was already inside the fence. Wyatt grabbed the flashlight and the rifle, heart thumping steady. Hank moved ahead of him, tail stiff, body low. They reached the backyard just as the wind shifted. A shadow moved near the tool shed. Hank didn't wait. He exploded across the grass, faster than anything that old should have been able to move. The intruder turned too late. There was a yell short and panicked, followed by the unmistakable sound of impact. A body hitting the ground. A sharp, desperate scream. By the time Wyatt reached them, one man was gone, bolting into the orchard, flashlight bouncing in his hand. But the other was still there, crumpled beneath Hank's weight. Blood streaked down his arm from a torn sleeve. Hank stood over him, snarling now, muzzle curled back but teeth untouched. Not mauling, just holding. Wyatt pulled the man up by the collar, flipped him against the shed. He was young, 20s maybe, pale and shaking. "Who sent you?" Wyatt barked. The man didn't answer. Wyatt pressed the rifle barrel just below his chin. "One more time." But the guy only spat blood to the side and looked away. "You're already dead," he whispered. Then he jerked free and ran, clutching his shoulder, vanishing into the trees. Wyatt started after him, but Hank barked once sharp, then turned toward the ground near the shed. Something was there. A black duffel bag had been dropped in the dirt. Wyatt knelt, unzipped it. Tools, crowbars, bolt cutters, rope, and a laptop. Still warm. He pulled it out, cradled it in one arm, and looked at Hank. "You got them before they got in." Hank panted quietly, blood on his coat that wasn't his own. Back inside, Wyatt booted the machine. It buzzed, blinked, then launched straight into a locked screen. No background, no programs, just a password prompt. He tried Gray's name, denied. He tried random strings from the ledger, denied. Then for 1 second a flicker a window flashed and vanished. But it was enough. One word caught his eye. Apex. He froze. "Son of a bitch," he whispered. The laptop wasn't just a tool, it was a field device, the kind used in active operations. Surveillance logs, communications, target maps, hidden folders that smelled like military black projects and private intel firms. He pulled the hard drive. An hour later, he had forced his way into the file tree. No user-friendly folders here. Just code, acronyms, and files marked with flags from 6 countries. But one folder had a name that turned his stomach. Orchard_Reclamation. Inside there were photos, grainy surveillance shots, one of Wyatt by the porch, another of Hank sitting in the field, and then a third. The ledger. Open. Spread on Wyatt's table. Taken from outside the window. They'd been closer than he thought. Wyatt leaned back, the weight of it all crashing down. They weren't just watching. They had already started erasing him, piece by piece. But they'd made one mistake. They underestimated the dog. Hank lay nearby, eyes open, chest rising slow but strong. He watched Wyatt without blinking, like he already knew the next move. "You bought me time tonight," Wyatt said quietly. "They were coming for everything. And you stopped them." Hank didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to, because he knew. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. They came when the sky was still pink with dusk. Wyatt had just locked the front door. The house smelled like dust and old paper, and the wind was shifting again. It always did before something went wrong. He didn't know how he knew that, but Hank did. The dog hadn't touched his food all day, hadn't laid down once, just paced, watched, waited. The files from the stolen laptop sat open on the table. Dozens of names. Wire transfers. Holdings connected to Apex Consortium. Wyatt had compiled everything onto a flash drive, backed it up twice, and hidden one copy beneath the loose board in the kitchen pantry. The other stayed on him, clipped inside his inner jacket pocket, right beside the key. He was reaching for his thermos when Hank growled, not the warning growl, not the one that said someone was nearby. This one was different. It was the growl that came just before a strike. Then glass shattered. The back window exploded inward, and in the same breath, the front door splintered off its hinges. Wyatt dropped to the floor as a boot slammed through the entryway. The house filled with movement shadows moving too fast. Bodies in black clothing, masks covering everything but the eyes. Wyatt rolled behind the sofa, heart hammering. He reached for the hunting rifle stashed beneath the cushions, but before he could raise it, Hank had already launched. A flash of fur, muscle, and fury slammed into the first intruder. The man hit the floor hard with a muffled grunt. Hank's jaws clamped down on his arm. Screaming echoed in the hallway. Wyatt bolted for the back, ducking low, the flash drive clutched in his fist. Another figure came through the kitchen, swinging something heavy. Wyatt dodged left, slammed the man into the refrigerator, and drove a shoulder into his chest. The guy crumpled, stunned, but not out. Wyatt didn't wait. He leapt over the kitchen table and dove for the cellar door, yanking it open. He dropped into the crawl space just as Hank barked again, sharp and pained. A yelp followed. Wyatt froze mid-step. Then a thud. Silence. No more barking. Wyatt's vision blurred for half a second. The breath caught in his throat. He nearly went back up the stairs. But he didn't. Hank's last move had bought him time. He couldn't waste it. He crawled through the dirt beneath the floorboards, heart pounding, boots scraping against a loose rock. Above him, footsteps thudded through the house. Voices called out, angry, short commands. Then the sounds began to retreat. One door slammed, then another. Silence returned like a slap. Wyatt waited a full minute. Then two. When he finally emerged, the house was torn apart. Furniture overturned, cabinets broken open, papers everywhere. And Hank. He lay just inside the hallway, blood darkening the fur around his head. One of his eyes was closed, the other blinked slow and dazed. Wyatt dropped to his knees beside him, hands shaking. "Jesus, Hank! Hank, look at me!" The dog's tail flicked once. Wyatt felt the sting in his chest like a round had hit him. He ran his hand over Hank's side. No broken bones, no wounds on the torso, just the head. He'd taken a blow meant for someone else. Wyatt wrapped him in the only blanket that hadn't been shredded and lifted him into the truck. The vet clinic was 30 minutes away. He made it in 20. They didn't ask questions. The vet was a retired army medic, and when Wyatt kicked in the door, all he said was, "Back room." Lay him down. Wyatt paced the hallway while they worked. Every second was a memory he didn't want. Bomb blasts, bodies, the sound of someone slipping away while you couldn't do a damn thing. Finally, the vet stepped out, peeling off bloody gloves. 17 stitches, he said. He's lucky. Skull didn't fracture. He's out cold, but breathing steady, Wyatt sat down hard. He took a bat to the head, he said. He didn't even flinch. The vet looked at him. That's not luck. That's loyalty. Back at the orchard, Wyatt carried Hank inside and laid him down near the fireplace. The dog's breathing was slow, shallow, but solid. Wyatt sat beside him all night. He didn't sleep. Couldn't. The files were still safe. The flash drive had never left his pocket. But everything else had changed. They hadn't come to negotiate this time. They came to end it. And Hank had stood between Wyatt and the darkness, same as he always had. Morning broke with hard light pouring through broken windows. Wyatt made coffee he wouldn't drink. He cleaned up the blood, rehung the cellar door, fixed what he could. Hank didn't move much, but around noon he lifted his head, just enough to look at the front door, the spot where he always sat. Wyatt watched him crawl, legs stiff, head low. Every step looked like agony. But he made it, and when he reached the door, he lay down, facing outward, same position, same posture, still guarding. Wyatt knelt beside him. "You're out of your mind, you know that?" he whispered. Hank didn't blink, because he wasn't done. Not yet. The courtroom wasn't built for legacy battles, not the kind where a man shows up with a working dog and a USB drive that could burn half a boardroom to the ground. But Wyatt stood there anyway. The oak-paneled room was filled with silence thick enough to choke on. Apex Consortium's legal team had arrived like an avalanche 3 suits deep, each holding a stack of motions and one-liners sharpened like knives. Their lead counsel, a sleek man named Gray, paced behind the plaintiff's table with the calm of someone who'd never lost and didn't intend to start now. Wyatt wore jeans and a weathered button-up. No tie, no theatrics, just the truth in his hand and a German shepherd at his side, head wrapped, ears cocked toward every sound. Hank hadn't left his side since the night of the attack. Not once. "Mr. Wyatt Langston," the judge began, eyeing him over glasses that looked older than the court itself. "You're here claiming legal succession over a previously unreported trust, with assets estimated at $35 million. Wyatt nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. Hidden within the property I inherited from my grandfather, Harold Langston Gray was already rising." "Objection, Your Honor. There's no credible proof the claimant had any prior knowledge of this alleged trust. Apex Consortium asserts the funds in question were misappropriated from shell subsidiaries we jointly managed with Mr. Langston. We have documentation which I've reviewed," the judge said, holding up a folder, "and I've also seen the documents submitted yesterday, including the encrypted storage unit, the notarized map, and the digital backups. Let's proceed." Wyatt exhaled through his nose. He hadn't breathed right in days. What followed was less trial, more trench warfare. Gray's team attacked from all sides, trying to discredit Wyatt's military past, implying he had a motive to forge evidence. They hinted he'd exploited his uncle's dementia, claimed the documents were staged, the GPS coordinates tampered with. Every time Wyatt pushed back, they pivoted. But what they didn't expect was the video. Wyatt queued it up mid-hearing. It had been recovered from a corrupted security drive Hank had dug up near the barn. Just another part of the map the dog had remembered. A cache sealed beneath rotted floorboards. The video showed Harold Langston, hunched but lucid, time-stamped 6 months before his death. "If anything happens to me, Wyatt knows the truth," he said to the camera, voice gravelly. "He served this country with more honor than any of the bastards I did business with. He's the only one I trust with it all." He looked off camera. "Hank, come here, boy." The frame shifted as the dog, years younger, tail wagging, stepped into view and sat at Harold's feet. He remembers more than I do these days. The courtroom went still. Even Gray didn't speak for several seconds. Later, when the judge recessed for lunch, Gray cornered Wyatt in the corridor outside the courtroom. "You're not smart enough to pull this off yourself," he said softly. Wyatt smiled, but there was no humor in it. "You're right," he replied. "I had help." He looked down. Hank sat beside him, ears alert. After the break, the court reconvened. Wyatt's final piece of evidence was a ledger buried inside the hard drive the intruder had left behind. The ledger listed Apex front companies, payments routed offshore, and a pattern of siphoned funds leading back to the Orchard Trust. The judge raised an eyebrow and asked for copies. Gray looked like a man watching a noose tighten. It didn't take long after that. The ruling came down near 4 p.m., but it might as well have been thunder. The court recognizes Mr. Wyatt Langston as the lawful beneficiary of the Langston Trust and sole owner of the estate known as Raven Ridge Orchard. The funds are to be unfrozen immediately. Furthermore, Apex Consortium is to be investigated for financial misrepresentation. It hit Wyatt like a weight lifting, not a celebration. He didn't raise his fists, didn't gloat. He just looked down at Hank. The dog didn't bark, didn't even blink. He just leaned his head against Wyatt's leg like he had 1,000 times before, steady and certain, like he knew all along. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters waited, microphones ready. Wyatt gave one statement. "Most of what was found I wouldn't have found without him," he said, patting Hank's flank gently. He remembered the map. The smells. The places Harold used to go when he didn't want to be followed. "I just followed Hank. One reporter asked if he'd keep the money." Wyatt shrugged. "Some of it." "The rest. Harold meant for it to protect something. Not just land, not just me. Another asked about the night of the attack. Wyatt didn't answer. He just glanced at Hank. The scars beneath the fur. The way the dog still walked with a limp. How he stood a little closer to Wyatt every time someone raised their voice. He didn't need to answer. Hank already had. The wind rolled gently through the pines as morning sunlight washed over the valley. What had once been a forgotten orchard now stood transformed, reborn into something that meant more than inheritance or legacy. It was now a place of healing. A low-slung, timber-framed facility nestled against the hillside bore a new sign at its gates. The Langston Center for Veterans and Retired K-9s. Beneath it, carved in clean, strong lettering, "He didn't bark for glory." He barked so I could heal. Wyatt Langston stood under that sign, hand resting on the graying neck of the dog who had given him everything. Hank didn't move much these days. His right hind leg dragged slightly, and his eyes had grown cloudy. But when the sun broke through the trees each morning, he still pulled himself to the gate, and lay in his usual spot, head high, ears alert, watching the road. The center had been open just under 2 months, yet already veterans were arriving. Some walked with canes, others carried invisible burdens. Some had their dogs with them. Others had lost theirs years ago, but still reached for something in the silence. Wyatt met every one of them at the door. "I'm not here to fix you," he'd say, "but you'll have space to start again. You and your dog, if you've got one." He never wore a uniform. Just worn jeans, old boots, and that look in his eyes, the one that said he knew what it felt like to be cracked in half and stitched back together by something four-legged and loyal. On one particular morning, a local journalist came by to do a story. Young, fresh-voiced, half-prepared for another vanilla profile on a post-war non-profit. She expected numbers, maybe a few sentimental quotes. What she got instead was a silent dog and a man who pointed at him before answering any question. "That one right there?" Wyatt said. "He saved me in more ways than I can count." The reporter jotted notes, watching Hank breathe slow under the shade of a tall oak. "You said he helped you find a hidden fortune. Not just money." He remembered places, scents, things my uncle left behind. I would have missed them. "You're saying the dog led you to a trust worth $35 million? Wyatt smiled. "I'm saying that what matters is what we did with it." The reporter blinked, then asked, "Why use it to build this? You could have gone anywhere. Lived however you wanted." Wyatt crouched beside Hank, letting the old dog lean against him. His voice dropped. "You ever been in a place where it feels like nobody sees you? Not for who you were, or what you gave, but just as something broken?" The reporter nodded slowly. "That was me. After the war. After my uncle died. After everything. But this dog, he stayed. Even when I couldn't speak. Even when I couldn't breathe." Wyatt ran a hand gently over Hank's back. "So, yeah, I built this place for others like me. For those who served and the ones who served alongside them, especially the ones who can't speak for themselves." The reporter lowered her pen for a moment. "Would you say he barked to protect you?" Wyatt glanced at Hank. "No," he said softly. "He barked so I could find my way back." By noon that day, the story had gone viral, not because of the millions or the scandal with Apex, but because of a single line the reporter chose to end her piece with. "He didn't bark for glory. He barked so his human could begin again." Weeks later, people came from across the country. Veterans brought ashes of dogs long gone. Others came to adopt the retired K-9s who now filled the center's kennels, each one with scars, stories, and eyes that had seen too much. Children played in the open field behind the lodge. Sometimes Hank would watch them, tail flicking just slightly. Other times he'd nap beneath the porch where Wyatt now gave talks to other handlers, telling them what it meant to serve beside a dog that refused to quit. But no one ever forgot who made it possible. Not Wyatt, not the veterans, not the dogs. One morning, as fall began to paint the trees gold, a little girl asked her dad, "Why does that old dog lie at the gate every day?" The father looked over and smiled. "Because he's still guarding the only home that ever healed his soldier." And Hank, eyes barely open, seemed to understand. He'd never barked for medals, never cared for cameras. He barked to keep danger away. He barked to help Wyatt breathe again. He barked so one broken man could stand tall and build something that would outlast both of them. That night, as crickets hummed in the orchard trees and the last light faded over the hills, a quiet question lingered in the breeze. One whispered by the wind, carried on the scent of pine and memory. What's your story with a loyal pet? If this story moved you or reminded you of a loyal companion who changed your life, help us share their legacy. Subscribe to German Shepherd for more true inspired tales of courage, healing, and the dogs who make it possible, because not all heroes walk on two legs.